Hi everyone, welcome to the IoT Heroes show. My name is Tom Raftery. I'm a global IoT evangelist for SAP. And with me on the show today, my guest is Andy Mulholland. Andy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, it's better to stick to the relevant. I've spent the last 4 years leading research at Constellation Research on IoT, and 4 years ago, people barely recognized the term. Before that, my background was as the Group Chief Technology Officer for Capgemini. So I've tended always to look at the subject much more around solutions and much more around the business applicability of the solution. So it's been a rather different path, and it's led me to focus much more on why would you want to do it, how would you want to do it, more than these are the pieces that can do it.
Great, that's perfect. The last couple of podcasts that we published were kind of around the pieces, and well, actually, the last one was more the vehicles and connected cars. But it's always good to approach it, I think, from a business perspective than a specific technology perspective, because the technologies change all the time, but very often the business needs don't.
Well, that's true, and pretty well we can argue that there's two sides to IoT. And one of them has been quite a long time in the development, which has been industrial automation in various manufacturing plants, etc. That's not new. What's changed is what we can do with that. The other side is the one that really is changing it, and it says that most companies accept their future is around services, services giving higher value. They accept they're going to a digital services economy, but they find it very difficult now to relate that to what does that mean? What do I do? Where's the value? And so the picture is still based on IoT internally for cost management, and externally, well, the web and the internet are going to do great things for us to deliver services, but very little connection between all those pieces.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, just to frame the conversation. My own interest in IoT, I've been working with IoT for quite a long time. Again, similar to yourself, long before it even had the term IoT, I was talking about connected energy and smart grids and things like that. Your background is more manufacturing, so this will be for people listening. This is going to be more a connected manufacturing conversation than anything else, really. And Andy, a lot of this has to do, I think, in the manufacturing particularly, it has to do with the improvements that we're seeing in data flows.
I think actually, I'd just say that manufacturing has been an early adopter, mainly because of the background we've just talked about. Other industries are doing it, but there's been some very significant drivers to do it in manufacturing. And of course, we all know that manufacturing suffered very heavily from cost pressure. That's also
So everything went east.
yeah. Well, that's also led us to think about product lifecycle management much more. So when you've taken this flow of solutions, people have much faster product life cycles now, and they need to extract value. They need to get the product up, out, running, extract value from it, and take it to a service generation and extract more value from a service generation. So they had the head start of knowing that IoT meant the way they operated and managed a factory could be much more efficient. Lean manufacturing, we understand the principle, we very rapidly improve each cycle. And adding in further degrees of instrumentation to that has already been happening for quite a lot of years, as you've pointed out. The question is, what can you do with that information? And previously, we've looked at reporting and operating a business on 30, 45-day cycles around standard business reporting. What lean manufacturing is saying is we have to do things on whatever is the right cycle. So if you're operating a machine, some machines it's daily, it can even be hourly, that you're trying to understand how to make the improvement. So that data is about the way we interpret it and use it, but in a very, very short time cycle of optimization, continuous optimization. Mm-hmm. That's the big change. Can we do that in a very different way?
Let me take a slightly different approach to this, Andy. Just for the sake of trying to get people, trying to help people comprehend the kind of change we're talking about, because I see it myself. I have a Fitbit, and the Fitbit that I have reads my pulse, my heartbeat. Now, if I go to the doctor's surgery, the doctor will take my pulse, and that'll be a snapshot of my pulse when I go into the surgery on a day when I'm feeling unwell, when maybe I've got half an hour and I've got another meeting coming up and I've got to get into that surgery, I've got to get that pulse taken or whatever it is, and then I've got to get out and go to that meeting, maybe get caught in a traffic jam, whatever. I'm under pressure at times, so I'm stressed out when I get into the doctor's place already. I'm not feeling well. He takes that snapshot of a pulse. Whereas on my phone, I now have 3 years of my pulse data saved every day, all day, 24 hours a day, going back 3 years. It's a completely different view of the data, and it's a hell of a lot more data. It's a much richer data set. But if I hand that over to the doctor, he won't know what to do with it. So, I mean, this is the kind of difference we're talking about in the manufacturing space. I think it's the move from, as you say, getting 30, 40-day reports to getting 30-minute reports. And suddenly there's a swathe of information there. And are the manufacturers able to cope? Do they know how to handle it? I mean, my doctor wouldn't know how to handle it if I handed him my Fitbit application.
Well, it's a very interesting example, actually, because the rest of the story would be that if they really were worried about you, they would have strapped a device on you for a day and then taken it back.
True.
The cost of doing that is actually very high.
Yep.
Whereas what really has changed in that is the cost dropped dramatically, and therefore the period you could examine became longer. And from that, you start to see these things we call insights. So if I now try and relate that a little bit more to the subject, and we talk about an insight, let's really expand the horizon for a moment, and we'll talk about one of the pioneers that everyone knows the name of in doing this, General Electric. And we'll talk about the way they've instrumented jet engines for a number of years. And they've known exactly what's going on in a jet engine. But the real point about that is that from that, we got to power by the hour. So we don't sell the engine, we sell the output, we sell the what do you want? You want to use it. You don't want to actually buy it. You want to use it, and in that you want it maintained, etc.
Yeah.
There is a link back to your Fitbit in a moment, I promise.
Go on.
But what they've learned out of that is that the power by the hour assumed all engines were equal and all uses were equal. What they now know is that an airline that is based in and flies in and out the Middle East in hot, sandy, dusty conditions sees a very different wear profile to the one in Scandinavia who's doing it in the cold and every other extreme in between.
Yeah.
So what they now know is it's not power by the hour as an overhead prediction on that engine. They can now charge by the wear factors that different people are utilizing it by. So if we come back now, that's a very good service example of saying if I had more data in a very different way to the data I've had before, I could understand how that related to service. Now, if we come back to your Fitbit watch, the people who do understand your Fitbit watch are the insurance companies. And they understand that if you do your 10,000 steps a day, then you're likely to be a much more healthy individual, and they will reflect it in your premium.
Right.
So where we're going with this is it's not kind of the data model we saw before and the kind of, well, that's a nice snapshot of the time of showing the machine and where. We want to know actually about key assets. We want to know how we're using them. And people have talked a long time about shifting from CapEx, buying the machine, buying the jet engine, buying maintenance on the jet engine and power by the hour, to now saying, no. It's actually about OPEXing that asset. So I actually really understand that asset, and I understand exactly how it's being used, and I understand exactly what costs and overheads belong to it, and those that don't. And from that, I can build a very different responsive model about how I charge. So when we come back to the services element, the only thing you can do with the services model is reflect what people use the service for. So you actually want to go the whole of the way around. So now visualize your factory and ask, are you going to be buying all those big expensive machine tools? Or are they going to come as a service that you use them? And will you pay for the wear you put in them so that when you're not using the asset, it's not actually a direct charge on your business? That's where the whole IoT argument will take us. It will take us to the idea that we actually uniquely understand every asset and how that is built into our business model in order to be the concept for a long time, a very agile enterprise, because we know how our cost models work. And they're not just overhead models, and they're not just cost efficiency drives on overhead models. They're actually rethinking our company model.
Yeah. And this is something that people are starting to talk about now, the whole manufacturing as a service and the digital economy and the whole shift away from CapEx to OpEx. But I've still yet to hear anybody espouse how that will change things for me, for the consumer, for someone who buys something from a manufacturing organization. I mean, will the costs to the manufacturer drop as a consequence? I know the CapEx will drop, it'll shift to OpEx, but will the overall cost drop? And will that be reflected in prices of purchases that I as a consumer make? Or will it just be a different cost structure for the manufacturer?
Wow, there's a lot of questions in that statement. Well, let's try and break it out. Contract manufacturing has boomed. Why? Because companies actually want to remember what it is they really do that adds value versus what they have to do to add costs. So if you're in the electronics business, chances are you get a lot of your product made by a contract manufacturer.
Sure. The
We've got the idea of manufacturing as a service. If we think about manufacturing as a service, that contract manufacturer has to be very good at using the manufacturing assets, because implicit in the argument is they can do it for less money, and that also implicitly means they can change what they make more quickly for less money. Mm-hmm. So at one end of the argument, we've already seen contract manufacturing take specialist tasks and shorten product life cycle management because they can change the product so quickly. The other end of the task is, what do we as consumers want to do? The interesting thing is the consumer dimension has changed more rapidly because we don't have to cost justify a CapEx expenditure if we buy a toothbrush that happens to have a Bluetooth connection. So we've all played around with it a lot more, and we've come to the idea that we quite like having information, we quite like using things, doing things. So we've very rapidly adopted to a service economy. So the idea of buying a piece of hardware and then being able to set it the way you want it, to make it connect to your network in your home, which is IoT again, is rapidly establishing itself amongst that. Now, last time you can argue those things happened, they happened with mobile phones. Companies did not buy mobile phones for their staff at the beginning. People bought them and learned why it had value. PCs went through the same cycle. The internet went through the same cycle. So we seem to be going through product adoption cycles or technology adoption cycles, which then with them bring cultural cycles that change business. So I would argue at the moment, where we are on that is that as consumers, we're readily adapting to a services economy and readily understanding its value to us and culturally accepting it to be that way. So that will flow back into companies thinking, I have to support that, that's my market, and there isn't a resistance. So I would say at the moment that according to what you look at, you can argue how far down the curve it is. So if you're going to take the house, I would say it's fairly well down the curve. If you're going to take car, I'd say it's coming up very sharply on people's visibility. But if we take that for a moment and ask another question, is are we still thinking about things in the same way? So when we say car, we think the car is the object and the services must be around the car. That's old-fashioned thinking. See, there's just been a interesting buyout in the industry where one company's bought another for no other reason than it's saying the entertainment at home is personal to you, and when you get in a car, that entertainment should be with you. So the other thing about the services economy, and the other thing we're all learning, is it's cross-functional. That's going to be a big challenge for the manufacturer at the back. And I always say the same thing to them. I say, The problem that we have now is not multi-channel as we knew about the web. It's multi-device, multi-service, and we don't necessarily have the same structure that our services will fit in, that we are confidently assuming is the next few years' path. That example I've just given you, along with several other examples that I know you know and we've talked about in the past, all point to the fact that start IoT in the realm you understand of your own business, but you're doing that in preparation for the way that understanding is going to change the way your business works in a digital services economy.
Yeah, I mean that's why the likes of Google and Apple and SAP are getting involved in connected cars.
Yes, it's a connected device. It's another connected device, and in using that connected device, you will have a host of associated services. The services needn't be directly about the car. They're about what you're doing because you're in a car, where you're going, what's going on with your life. You know, it's part of your life model, part of what you're doing today. I'm going to get taken out shopping, I'm sure, by my wife today because we're coming up to Christmas. And the car's function in that is to convey us to the shops. Which shops? What are we going to buy? How do we decide? That could be part of a different package that invokes the car as well. If you want to look at that one in a very interesting sense, it's Uber. And if you're in the States and you use TripAdvisor and you look at a restaurant or you look at a hotel, then on that page you will find a button, if you're in an Uber city, to call the Uber to take you to that address. And the Uber knows where you're standing and it knows where you want to go. So it's an embedded service. That's how we'll see these things ultimately progress.
Yeah. And do you think, well, I guess this is a difficult question because the answer to this is yes, but or it depends. But where are manufacturers along the maturity of figuring out all this, of figuring out how to shift their current business models to what's coming down the line?
Oddly enough, in the boardroom, the take-up's been of understanding has been much better than you might think, primarily because of Industry 4.0 in Europe and industrial internet in the States. In both of them, there are some very strong parties and some very, very interesting things that have been done, and one boardroom does tell another. So in manufacturing, the penny has dropped, or the fennec has dropped, or however you like to think of it, or the cents dropped. But it seems to have hit the consciousness. The challenge that hasn't hit the consciousness is that there's a tendency to look sideways at your traditional competitors and say, well, I'm moving at the same rate as them. I think that's very dangerous because, as I've proved in quite a lot of cases, your real competitor is actually a lot of companies bidding for very high value parts of the services model around transport or manufacturing or whatever. And in the case of taxis, cars, transportation, nobody saw Uber coming. It took it over. And you can repeat that argument in other places. So,
but I mean,
yeah.
an obvious one to look back at is the likes of Johnson Controls being hit by the likes of Nest. I mean, that was one nobody saw coming. At thermostats, I mean, what the hell?
Well, actually, that's a very interesting example because if you go back about 3 years, then the building management services industry, Johnson, Honeywell, etc., they were very, very sure that they understood exactly what the future was. And they were all talking about the superiority of their products. Today, they talk about the superiority of services. Johnson's bought Tyco. Honeywell's doing other things, etc. In other words, yes, you're absolutely right. They didn't see it come. And you can see this in other places as well. So my message to the manufacturing industry is you got the idea, you got the principle, you know things are moving. But in your sector, stop looking at your traditional competitors. Start looking at all the smaller companies who are trying to take bites out of you, because one of those bites could be a really painful one quicker than you realize.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, for anyone who's in a manufacturing, who's in a board or in a manufacturing organization at any kind of level, you know, Where do they look to see where this competition might jump up and bite them from?
Well, this is where the industry gets self-interested in it. The simple answer is the industry's changed. The tech industry has changed as well. When I say these companies can jump up and bite you, one of the reasons people will give is that they don't have the legacy model to worry about. Well, actually, the legacy model should be a strength. And so in looking at this and looking at what you do about it, then you can look at some of the other ways it's been handled, where John Deere is another famous example, where they've actually managed to take their ability to organize and do around their key farming equipment and then connect it to become the huge advantage that everybody else now wants to connect to. So in saying this, we're not necessarily saying that you walk away from everything you know around IT. That's your strength. That's how your company works. That's what it does. Your question is, how do you actually use that strength to compete? And it comes down to another popular phrase. People talk a lot about AI without really understanding it. If you term it augmented intelligence or augmented experience, which is you've learned lots of things in your company. There's lots of embedded information and experience. And if you can't bring that to the fore to understand then how to use that and use that leverage of installed base, etc., that's a pretty poor show, because it is happening. But
I get it though, but I guess it's profoundly difficult for people in organizations like that to say to themselves that this is their core knowledge set, or that this is their core. I mean, if you're that deep in an organization, you think everybody knows this stuff, and that it's hard to step outside and see that this is actually valuable information that you own.
yeah, it's very hard. And companies, of course, particularly manufacturing, if you can't manufacture it, they say, well, you can't do it. But then we've talked earlier about contract manufacturing, and if you take the car industry, the ability of BMW versus Mercedes to bend a piece of steel to make a car wing is no differentiator.
Yeah.
Might be a differentiator if they could get a cost advantage on it of maybe 10%. That might be a differentiator, because that implies that the rest of the car, they would get a similar cost advantage. But the reality is that nobody bought a BMW or a Mercedes for the beautiful curve in the wing. It might be part of a bigger package of, I appreciate how it looks, I appreciate its quality, etc. So it's really their ability to design the right car to appeal to the right sector of the market, work out how to put it together so it's a really good quality car, and support it in service. It's not actually bending the metal and making wheels or tires, as Henry Ford would have said years ago. All of that is other people's key advantage.
Speaking of the car industry, though, and the move to as a service, how do you think the BMWs and the Mercedes of the world are lined up for the as a service transportation industry, where people no longer buy cars but they rent them as a service?
That is absolutely fascinating point, because I read on Friday, I think it was, a very interesting survey where they'd looked at people's attitudes about buying cars. And the big thing they were looking at is people buying electric cars. And people who buy electric cars have a hugely different attitude to them to the people who buy conventional cars. Uh-huh. And this came out because they asked the question, would you be prepared to do an Airbnb? And I don't remember the exact figures, but we're in the mid-60s of people who buy electric cars saying yes, and we're in the teens of people who buy conventional cars.
Wow.
And it was drawing the differentiation, and it said people who bought electric cars bought them for very practical reasons. People who bought other cars had a much higher emotional reason. Now the question is, are all those trends working at once? Yes, they are. So where on that does it put the next trend, which says, are people buying transportation? Now, clearly, GM thinks they have to change because they bought Lyft, so they're trying to form a relationship about your transportation requirements, not necessarily only a car. But that's another example of how attitudes change. Yeah. I'm probably older, I like cars, I like driving, so I've been one bit. whereas one of my sons I know for sure is in the other part.
And I would say there's a middle ground because I know several people who own Teslas. And for them, it's a very emotional experience to own and to drive a Tesla. So I'm not sure how they would fare on the Airbnb question.
That's very interesting, actually, because I would buy a Tesla, and I would confess to myself to being a self-confessed petrol head.
There you
Why?
go.
Because its design and its other issues are very appealing. So the way they've done it
Yeah.
appeals. So again, we're back to this fact that how did that differentiate them? Well, they differentiated themselves because they could get a design around their experience into that package. So again, we're back to some very common phrases here. Experience. How do you repackage things? Because services are consuming experiences. Ownership is a different experience.
Yeah.
So again, we're back to this whole argument about the digital services economy is not the internet web economy revved up. It's taking the whole thing to a new stage of connected interdependency and activity, and how what we do functions in that business network of services. So we have a role in a network of things that are happening, and that role we have to define, and those are the services we will have. And that links all the way back to how we think of ourselves, think about product, think of what we build, think of how it's used, sold, think of how we buy the things we're going to use in our factories, etc. It's a chain of change.
And like any of these things, I mean, William Gibson said it very well when he said the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I mean, I think, it'll happen faster in some areas, some geographies than others. Some places will leapfrog in the developing world, for example. Others will have legacy issues and it'll take longer to get there.
Absolutely, and the mobile phone itself is a very good example of that one with connectivity. They've missed out the wired era in a number of states. But I think if we come back to it, the one question that people always say is, when's it going to hit me? And my reply is, it has hit you. The question is, have you noticed?
Yeah.
Because IoT is not something you wake up on Thursday and decide to start a project on Monday. IoT is happening.
Yeah.
Every device everywhere that's coming out is gaining much more ability to connect and much more ability to harvest data. Why? Chips get cheaper. Service connectivity like LoRa everywhere in the Netherlands, South Korea, and shortly elsewhere gets easier. So against that background, IoT is happening. Fact.
Yeah.
The question for your company is, how do you learn how to respond? And the smartest way to learn how to respond is to start to look at applying it internally and learning lessons about what kind of things you can do and what you can learn, and then relating that to what's happening externally.
Yeah, and a very good data point on that was I visited Schneider Electric 2 years ago, I think it was September 2014, when they were opening their new North American headquarters. And their CTO, whose name slipped my head at the moment, but a very bright guy, Pascal, I think it is, French guy, he talked about how it cost them at the time, less than $2 to put a system on a chip on everything they were manufacturing. So they said, if it's going to cost us less than $2 per device, why wouldn't we do it? So every single device they were shipping, everything, had already, at that time, in 2014, a system on a chip built in.
Yep, and the thing that used to be the problem that has also changed has also been, do you have to connect it to power? And the other big change over about a 2-year period has been the capabilities of batteries. So relatively straightforward sensing equipment now will run for 10 plus years on the same battery.
Yeah.
So it's a game change. If you go out and look at utilities in the Netherlands, where they've got a lot of water that they have to monitor in case they get flooded, these things are sort of somewhere around about $12 to $25 a time to do simple pressure sense or simple open shut sense, and they link onto a LoRa network for virtually nothing a year. So why wouldn't you, as you've just said, when the guy's there doing routine service, why wouldn't you be telling him just whack these on these points? and enter it. Now, that's the kicker I want to end on personally, because we've talked a lot about applying it, but there are some very, very clear things to think about. One is that we are talking about something that's going to multiply by hundreds of thousands, millions, billions. We all know that over the next few years. Think of mobile phones if you can think of nothing else, and the ramp up and the numbers. So when people start thinking about this and they start doing what I've just said, it actually is key that they start proper documentation and they link it back to their existing documentation. Because it's great to know that, look at this Watergate, I now know this, this, and this. That's singular. Take the, I don't know, 10,000 Watergates in the Netherlands, probably more. Now think about that, and now think about the fact that when you get an alarm, you need to know which one, where it is, you need to relate all the paperwork to it, you need to know how it's maintained, what part it is, a host of things. You know, when new phases start, people get enthusiastic and they do pilots, and that's great because we learn a lot. But one of the lessons that's usually learned from a pilot is, I wish I'd known where I was going to end up. In other words, we tend to do a pilot in a fairly limited manner, and we tend to limit it within the budget, within a lot of other things. And almost invariably, it doesn't then serve us well into connecting up. So my lesson about this that I inferred earlier is, you have a huge amount of documentation, which is an asset in itself. You have a huge amount of information. The question is how you tie these two things together as much as it's exploit the new things.
Very good. Andy, for anyone who's listening who wants to learn more about all of this, because there's a huge amount to learn, are there any good books you could recommend on this topic, for example?
Actually, funnily enough, because the topic is so vast, there isn't. My standard recommendation to people is that there are a lot of quite good events around. And I was doing, shortly before this call, actually some work on one, and I mentioned it to you at the beginning. But it doesn't matter. We'll use it as an example. Event in London in mid-March, Smart IoT. If you go to a big exhibition of IoT, you can look around and you can browse. Now, we stopped going to exhibitions because we don't have to. We can find it on the internet.
Yeah.
The problem with that is it infers you know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for and you need to get ideas, you need to soak yourself in, you need to go browsing. And in this case, I recommend to people, start physically browsing. That's why the numbers attending exhibitions have gone steadily up last year, because there's so much new technology in this space that going to a show has several advantages. Everybody's spread out in front of you. You can browse them at your leisure. You can pick what's relevant to you. You can walk on the stand, and almost certainly you're going to be able to get a good demo and talk about people who really know and understand it. So for your first learning stages, I recommend that course of action to see what strikes home to you more than any of the books at the moment, all of which seem to be sliced round a particular area. Try and get a more generic feel first.
Yeah, it's great advice. And for anyone who's listening who wants to know more about you or your writings, because you've got a very good blog, where should people go to find you online?
Well, it's very kind of you to say it's a good blog. Thank you. The simplest thing is to just Google Andy Mulholland blog, or if you need to, Andy Mulholland Constellation Research blog, and you shouldn't have any trouble at all finding it.
Okay, and you're on Twitter?
I am on Twitter with a slightly strange handle because it goes back to a long time ago, and it's CTO on the board. The reason for that was that it was becoming apparent quite a few years ago when Twitter first started that technology was becoming a boardroom issue, and it was becoming a need to understand how what I would call a techno business will operate. So I used the name in the early days of Twitter, CTO on the board. It got a certain amount of currency, so I've stayed with it.
Okay, excellent. Andy, that's been fantastic. I think it's been a great conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you too, Tom, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you and others. This one's got a long way to go yet before we know what the next era really looks like in 10 years' time.
I think you're right. Okay, thanks a million. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you same time, same channel next week.